The moment the captain laughed, the entire room shifted. It wasn't loud, not mocking, just a casual, careless chuckle that floated across the Marine Corps briefing hall like a spark landing on dry leaves. But it was enough to make heads lift, shoulders stiffen, and conversations pause with the eerie tension of a place suddenly aware it had misread the weather. The woman standing across from him did not flinch. Her glove tightened once around the strap of her pack, a subtle contraction of muscle that betrayed a memory she never voiced aloud. The overhead lights caught the faint silvering on the edges of her name tape, evidence of sun, sand, and firestorms that had scorched more than cloth. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He simply didn't know, and ignorance, especially worn by those in authority, can bruise more than intentional ridicule. It had begun innocently, his attempt to lighten the mood before a joint training demonstration. He was a Marine Corps captain, used to the rhythm of jokes and banter, accustomed to easing tension with charm and confidence. When his eyes drifted to the woman in the Air Force flight suit, he'd offered a half-smile and asked what he thought was harmless. "All right, Lieutenant, what's your call sign? Don't tell me it's something cute." The air froze, not because of his words, but because of what followed. She didn't answer immediately. She had looked past him, as if measuring whether the moment deserved truth or silence, whether he, of all people, had earned the right to hear the name that clung to her like a shadow. He saw the hesitation and laughed, quick, thoughtless. A laugh meant to fill space, but instead it cracked something brittle in the atmosphere. A few Marines who overheard shifted uncomfortably, though they couldn't explain why. Something about her posture, erect, steady, too controlled, warned them all that the captain had stepped somewhere he didn't belong. She finally spoke, her voice low, steady, unadorned with emotion. "Sticky 6. The captain's expression faltered. For a heartbeat he almost smirked, ready to mistake it for a joke. But something in the room told him not to. Something in the stillness, something in the quiet inhale of every Marine within earshot. Her voice hadn't wavered, but her eyes held the hollow reflections of a night most of them had only heard rumors about. A night pinned in classified reports, whispered in squadron hallways, passed between pilots like a cautionary legend. Everyone knew the story, though few knew it belonged to her. The captain's throat tightened. For the first time since he'd entered the hall, his confidence slipped, replaced by a creeping cold that moved through him like a tide withdrawing before a violent wave. The name didn't amuse him anymore. It anchored itself in the silence and dragged the mood downward with the weight of something harrowing. She didn't add anything, didn't need to. The call sign carried its own gravity. Across the hall, a corporal looked down at his boots, guilt prickling at him for no reason other than instinctual respect. A staff sergeant straightened her stance, eyes fixed on the woman with a quiet recognition that only those who'd faced fire understood. Even the ventilation hum seemed muted, as if the building itself bowed its head. The captain swallowed, feeling the pressure of every unspoken truth settling into his chest. Her call sign had stopped him, frozen him, because he finally understood what he had stepped on. Not a joke, not a nickname, but a scar etched into identity. She walked past him then, not with arrogance, but with a calmness that made his pulse falter. Like someone long accustomed to being underestimated, yet never surprised when the world revealed its lack of caution. He turned slightly, watching her move toward the briefing table with controlled precision. And he realized, far too late, that he had just opened a door into a story far heavier, far darker, and far more extraordinary than anything he had expected from a simple question. And the room, every Marine in it, waited, held in a quiet that throbbed like a bruise, wondering what Sticky 6 truly meant and what it had cost her. The captain tried to smooth the moment with a nod, a silent acknowledgement meant to signal respect, but the gesture felt clumsy even to him. The woman, Lieutenant Mara Hale, did not notice or pretended not to. She moved with the kind of poise carved from survival, not training manuals. Each step carried a quiet certainty that unsettled those who watched her, though none could articulate why. They only felt the echo of something unspoken trail behind her, like the last trace of smoke after an explosion. She took a seat at the end of the long table, far from the low conversations of officers who had been waiting for the briefing to start. Her presence pulled attention like gravity. Even those who tried not to stare found themselves stealing glances. The captain remained standing for a moment longer, weighing the air between them, wrestling with the faint sting of remorse that pricked deeper than he expected. He replayed the exchange in his mind, not the words, but the stillness afterward, the slight change in her breathing, the way her shoulders didn't rise or fall unnecessarily, as though conserving strength taught by nights when breath had been a luxury. He did not know her story, but he could feel its contour sharp, edged, worn, heavier than she let the world see. And that was when the first whisper slipped across the room. Is that really her? One Marine muttered to another, too quietly for the captain to hear, but not quiet enough to go unnoticed by the wary glances of others. I heard she was the only one who crawled out of that mess, literally crawled. Came another hushed voice from the back. Someone else added, "Sticky six. That's what they called the survivors, except there weren't six by the end." Fragments of rumor scattered like shattered glass across the room, each piece reflecting a different angle of the truth. No one had the full story, only scraps of classified lines, the kind blurred in official reports where sentences disappeared into black, tout bars. But every fragment pointed to the same reality. Whatever had happened, she carried the weight of people no longer here to share it. Mara seemed immune to the murmurs, or perhaps she had long trained herself to absorb them without reaction. The captain, however, felt each whisper like a splinter under his skin. He didn't appreciate gossip, especially when directed toward someone he had unintentionally disrespected. The Marines weren't mocking her. If anything, their whispers carried awe, reverence, and a touch of fear. But the way they spoke of her story as if she were not sitting in the same room made something inside him tighten. The briefing finally began when the colonel entered, his pace clipped, expression stern. He didn't look at Mara the way others did. His gaze held recognition, the kind reserved for those who had earned their place through fire rather than rank. He opened his folder and laid a classified map on the table, tapping a finger against a cluster of marked coordinates. "We're running a joint force emergency extraction simulation," he announced, "designed from real events." Mara's eyes didn't flicker, but the captain noticed how her hands curled slightly under the table, as if bracing for impact. The colonel continued, unaware of the storm building beneath her stillness. "It's modeled after the downed bird incident in the Shamel corridor, the one involving an Air Force flight crew designation Echo 6. A ripple of dread moved through the room. Marines stiffened. A few exchanged looks of disbelief, because bringing that operation into a simulation felt dangerously close to touching a wound that had never healed. Mara remained silent, though her pulse began to drum softly beneath her skin. The colonel lifted his gaze. "Lieutenant Hale will lead the air integration portion of the demo. She has first-hand knowledge relevant to the scenario." The captain felt the bottom of his chest drop. He understood now Sticky 6 wasn't just a call sign. It was a living ghost tethered to her name, tied to the very operation this briefing was about to resurrect. He risked a glance at her. Her face was carved in composure, but her eyes held the stillness of someone balancing on the edge of a memory that still burned. The Marines around the table didn't speak, didn't move. They all felt the temperature shift, the subtle stir of grief or fear or something else nameless. Because they all knew Echo 6, or at least they knew how it ended, and they knew she had walked out of it alone. The colonel's voice faded into the background as the briefing shifted toward logistics and timings, but the captain found himself unable to focus. His eyes kept drifting toward the woman at the end of the table, Mara, the lieutenant whose call sign had cleaved the morning in half. She sat perfectly still, too still, the quiet coiling around her like a second skin. It wasn't the silence of calm, but the silence of someone listening to ghosts. A soft flicker of movement drew his attention. Mara's gloved thumb traced a slow, absent circle along the fabric seam of her sleeve, a gesture invisible to most, but telling to anyone who had ever carried the weight of something unspeakable. The captain recognized it, not the story, but the language, the muscle memory of reliving a moment one tried not to remember, and yet could never fully escape. The colonel shifted the map again, unaware of the tension woven through the room. The scenario involves a helicopter downed behind hostile lines. He continued. Limited comms, minimal visibility, terrain compromised. A murmur of unease stirred among the Marines. They knew this was no ordinary training exercise, not when it mirrored an event that had turned into a whispered legend, taught in survival courses but never openly discussed. Mara exhaled, slow and measured, as if bracing herself for the inevitable. The original team, the colonel added carefully, was designated Echo 6. She didn't react. She didn't need to. Her stillness was reaction enough. The captain felt the shiver in the room as the unspoken truth settled heavily upon them. The simulation was not just modeled after her experience. It was her experience, sanitized just enough instruction, but still raw, and she was being asked to walk back into it. One Marine near the back swallowed audibly. Another shifted, eyes lowered. Even among those who had never experienced combat, instinct told them this was a line that should be crossed only with reverence. The colonel pointed toward the terrain schematic. The name Sticky 6 was coined during the operation. It was meant to signify. He stopped himself. Mara's eyes lifted briefly, a flicker of warning stitched through them. She didn't need the colonel to explain. Everyone in the room had heard some version of the story, and she didn't want it retold like a campfire tale. Not when the reality had been blood, smoke, and decisions made in the dark. The colonel cleared his throat and concluded with a more measured tone. The lieutenant is the most qualified person to guide this exercise. Her insight will keep future crews alive. The captain's stomach tightened. For the first time he understood the ache beneath her stillness. Her survival wasn't pride. She wore it like a burden, not a badge. Whatever Sticky 6 meant, it had cost her more than the world realized. When the room finally dismissed, Mara rose without hurry, her movements controlled and deliberate. The captain hesitated before approaching her, guilt pulling at him like gravity. He knew he risked stepping into a space she might not welcome, but the need to acknowledge the harm he'd done pressed against his conscience. He followed her out of the briefing hall into the wide corridor, where sunlight filtered through tall windows, painting long shadows across the polished floor. She paused near the end, a faint tremor in her breath disappearing as quickly as it surfaced. "Lieutenant," he managed, keeping his voice low. He didn't correct his tone or rehearse his words. He simply let the truth surface in its raw form. "I didn't know." Mara didn't turn at first. The light from the window drew silver glints across the edges of her flight suit, like scars catching the sun. Finally, she faced him. Her expression was calm, not cold, not forgiving, simply neutral, a shield shaped by necessity. "You weren't supposed to," she said quietly, though her voice carried something deeper beneath the surface. Not accusation, not anger, weariness, the kind born from living through the sort of night that never ends. He wanted to ask 100 questions, wanted to understand, to make sense of the gravity behind her call sign, but the weight in her gaze gently warned him against it. Some truths were not meant to be requested, only offered. She stepped past him, leaving the scent of jet fuel and canvas faintly trailing in her wake. He watched her walk away, feeling the sting of the earlier joke burn deeper. Not because she had scolded him, she'd done nothing of the sort, but because silence, real silence, carried a sharper edge than reprimand. As she disappeared down the hall, he realized the name Sticky Six didn't haunt the room because of legend or rumor. It haunted because she embodied the story the world should have forgotten, and the burden she still carried was heavier than any rank or medal could measure. The sun had dipped low by the time joint force demonstration began on the open training range. Golden light stretched long across the gravel, gilding the edges of armored vehicles and casting stark shadows that seemed to sharpen every emotion simmering beneath the surface. The Marines stood in formation, helmets tucked under arms, the hum of anticipation vibrating through the air. They had trained for pressure, for fire, for chaos, but today carried a different weight, because today they weren't reenacting some distant scenario. They were stepping into the outline of a memory one woman had survived alone. Mara stood at the front, flight suit zipped to her collarbone, hands behind her back. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't rigid. She simply was a presence that drew every eye without demanding a thing. The captain stood just behind the line, unable to shake the feeling that he was witnessing something sacred, something fractured yet unbroken. The simulation unfolded with precision. A mock helicopter fuselage charred and bent to mirror the real wreckage, sat half, buried in sand. Smoke machines sent tendrils into the air, thin and gray, but Mara didn't seem to see them. Her gaze fixed on the wreck, as if time itself were peeling back, revealing a moment she had buried in pieces. When she finally stepped forward to brief the Marines, her voice was steady but softer than before, like words weighed down by echoes. "This isn't a scenario about tactics," she began, letting her eyes sweep across the formation. "It's about what happens when things fall apart faster than anyone can react." They listened, silent, respectful. Even the wind seemed to still. Echo 6 didn't go down because of pilot error. She continued. "We were hit, hard, no warning, no chance to correct. When we crashed, we weren't 6 anymore." The captain watched her breathe in as if drawing air from a place that had once offered none. "I was pinned," she said simply. No dramatics, no quiver, just truth. The rotor assembly collapsed. Fuel leaked everywhere. Fire came through the cabin in sheets. Every breath tasted like metal and burnt insulation. A few Marines lowered their eyes, not out of pity, but reverence. "I tried to pull the others out," she added, voice lowering. "Tried until my hands went numb, but the fire," her jaw tightened, and she let the sentence dissolve. Some stories didn't need their endings spoken aloud. She didn't cry. She didn't stumble. She didn't retreat into detachment. She simply stood in front of them, offering a truth stripped of embellishment. One of the rescue techs who finally reached me said it was a miracle I was still conscious. He said I was sticking to life with everything I had. She exhaled, a faint tremor in the release. That's where the name Sticky Six came from. It wasn't about gore. It wasn't about survival odds. It wasn't even about being the only one who lived. It was about refusing to let go, not of breath, not of hope, not of responsibility, until help finally tore her from the wreckage. The Marines didn't move. They didn't whisper. They simply absorbed her story in complete silence. The captain felt something shift inside him. Not guilt anymore, something deeper, respect that bordered on something almost spiritual. She hadn't survived by accident. She had survived through a stubborn, unyielding refusal to surrender to the flames that took the others. Mara stepped back, signaling the start of the hands-on portion of the exercise. The Marines dispersed, carefully navigating the mock wreck under her supervision. She corrected a stance here, a grip there, demonstrating how to stabilize a body in debris, how to drag someone under low flame, how to keep breathing when the air itself wanted to kill you. The captain approached only when she moved toward the edge of the site to catch a moment of solitude. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood beside her, sharing the same fading sunlight, the same cool breeze carrying the scent of dust and smoke. She finally glanced at him, not guarded, not weary, just present, "I shouldn't have joked earlier," he said quietly. No dramatic apology, no attempt to justify himself. "I know," she answered, but her tone held no accusation, only acknowledgement of a moment that had already transformed into something else. They stood in silence again, but this time it was a silence neither tried to avoid, a silence that healed rather than cut. After a long moment, she asked, "What did you think Sticky 6 meant?" He hesitated, then answered truthfully, "Honestly, something you'd laugh about years later, something light." Her gaze drifted toward the Marines training under her instruction. "Some names aren't for laughter," she murmured. "But they still matter." The captain nodded. He understood now. Maybe not the full depth of what she carried, but enough to know that respect was not an option but a requirement. As the sun dipped behind the distant hangars, casting the final gold streaks across the range, Mara turned and walked back toward the trainees, toward the smoke, the wreckage, and the lessons she alone could teach, and the captain watched her go, realizing that he had met someone forged by fire, yet defined by endurance. Someone whose call sign froze him not because of fear, but because it revealed a strength carved from loss. A name the world might whisper as legend, but one she wore simply as truth, Sticky 6.